Good evening and welcome. Again, I'm Lawrence Cherney, Artistic Director of Soundstreams, and I'm joined by, can you hear me, by the way? You can hear me okay? I'm joined by Dorothy Chang, who's the composer of one of the works being premiered tonight. I think it might be interesting for people to know a little bit about your own background in terms of how, I think people are always curious, how does one decide to become a composer? It's different probably from deciding to do a lot of other things. So perhaps you could tell us how it happened for you.
I always participated in music when I was young. I started out with piano lessons when I was around 6. I also took up clarinet. So all through my childhood, I was involved in school ensembles. And when I went to university, it didn't even dawn on me that people studied music. I had no role models. I had no one to encourage me to go that path. I went to university thinking I would study business, and I realized very soon after that I could not live without music in my life. So I enrolled in a basic composition course and realized, oh, this is a path I can take. And that was the end of that. So I think I kind of fell upon it. I found it fairly late in life, although I had composed a bit on my own when I was young. I didn't actually start studying it, didn't know you could study it until university.
Were there any figures that you encountered, especially in those formative years, that inspired you to go ahead and, seize the day?
It would just be my early teachers at university. I went to the University of Michigan. I was raised in a household where the children are all required to study piano and violin, but my parents were not musicians. I always say, had they known anything about the music business, they probably would have not allowed me to study music. So I would say I'm a musician in spite of my early childhood background.
And in terms of your own interests in composition, of course, tonight is the second work that Soundstreams has premiered, commissioned from you. And the first one was called Lost and Found. And actually it took some of us a while to realize that the found part didn't refer to the Chai Found Music Workshop, who are playing again tonight, who actually come from Taiwan. It took us a while to realize that wasn't a pun on the name. But in that particular work, you explored relationships between Eastern and Western instruments, and also, of course, Eastern and Western traditions. But that work, which was already 2011, I think, end of 2010, that wasn't the first time, of course, that you've explored this particular area. How far does it go back as a subject of interest for you?
My first piece written for mixed Western and Chinese instruments was in 2003. And I was approached by a group called Music from China, and they asked me to write a piece for a small ensemble. And that was fairly terrifying because I was born and raised in the US, and all of my training was Western. And although my last name is Chang, I knew nothing about Chinese music or the instruments. So it was like starting all over from scratch. Although I'm second generation, so my parents did try and instill in us Chinese culture, and I did have some exposure to Chinese music. I just never studied it formally. So there was a bit of familiarity, but very filtered, and through second generation Chinese American eyes and ears. That was my first time. I don't think that piece is performed too often because I wrote for the Chinese instruments without a great understanding for them. I've been in Vancouver for 10 years now and have the luxury of being surrounded by Chinese musicians, and now have access to those musicians and their knowledge and the instruments. And it's become, well, the piece in 2003 really sparked my interest in pursuing that. I always felt there was something missing from my compositional voice, being completely trained in the Western style, and yet in all other aspects of my life, I feel there is a good balance between the East and West. And
of course, you continue to write works that don't include any traditional instruments, Chinese or otherwise. And I was curious, of course, the sound world of these instruments has to play an important part when you're thinking through a work. And I'm wondering, there are a number of composers, of course, who also are quite fascinated by the medieval period and whose music has been influenced and inspired by that sound world as well. And I'm wondering if the curiosity that you have to explore obviously your own tradition, does it spill over into other areas as well?
I mean, Chinese and Western.
Yeah, any other combinations that have appealed to you that again are sort of outside of the box, you might say?
I haven't consciously pursued any other areas. I think there are two somewhat early influences that appear in my music, whether I want them to or not. One of them was just my early music training. I studied piano, but I was not very seriously classically trained. Having studied or begun playing clarinet since I was age 8, through university, that meant, let me do the math, 13 years of marching band. 13 years of entire seasons of repertoire in 4/4. So rhythm is something that I deal a lot with in my music, and it took me a long time to break free of the regularity of that grid because it was just so ingrained in me. And the other early influence was music, interdisciplinary collaborations. I had a good friend in high school who is now a theater director, and we started our collaborations back when we were in high school. And those are total theaters, so the music, the imagery, they're non-narrative pieces, they're image-based, and the music is quite abstract. So the idea of creating atmosphere and emotion or some sense of place without telling a story, I think that's influenced my music quite a bit.
It's funny that you mentioned, I didn't know about the marching band part of your background, but certainly your interest in rhythm. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the new work to be done tonight, because when you mentioned the marching band, there's a motif, a rhythmic motif in the first movement, and I've heard your piece now for the last 2 or 3 days, and I literally can't get it out of my head. I didn't associate it with a marching band, but it has a certain kind of insistence that's very difficult to get rid of. But maybe you could. The movements are quite different, one from the other, not just in terms of being slow and fast, although those contrasts are, of course, there as well. But maybe you could give our audience just a few thoughts about what sorts of things they might enjoy listening for as they hear the performance.
Okay. I might give a bit of background of how I approached this piece, simply because I did write a piece for similar instrumentation 2 years ago. In that one, I delved very deeply into the idea of Chinese and Western influences and what that meant to me. And I split that one into 5 movements as well, and each one dealt with the combination of Eastern and Western in a different way. When I had to write this piece, I thought, oh boy, what can I do now? I think I pulled out all the stops with the first one. So I decided to not go down the same path and instead treat the ensemble as more of a sound source. So rather than trying to delve further into this issue of balancing two cultures, I think I took more of an all-embracing, not asking any questions type of approach. In doing that, I wanted to explore the potential of the ensemble. So it also is in 5 short movements, but unlike the first work, this one, the 5 movements are quite independent from one another. I think it's more of a collection or a suite of movements rather than something that has an overarching narrative. And so each one is very different and gets at a different emotion or state of mind. I mean, thus the title, Small and Curious Places. A few of them were inspired by imagery or just a concept or a thought, I think of all of these as places, not necessarily geographical places, but a place of mind or a state of being. So for instance, the first movement, which I have no conscious connection to marching band music, is very rhythmic, and it's called Anticipation. And in that one, it starts with a motive. It's a single line, and as it gets repeated, it starts being shaded in, kind of like a single pencil line drawing, being shaded in with various colors and various depth. Anticipation is you never really know what will come out of the phrase. It might start with certain instruments playing in unison and then expand out to different colors, expand into unexpected harmonies. So that's the idea of anticipation. I won't go through all 5 of them, but for instance, the second movement is called, what is it called? Where Lost Memories Gather. And the idea of this was inspired by a string quartet I had been working on, and there you'll hear the string quartet playing sul ponticello. If you're not familiar with that technique, it's a certain technique the strings have where they're playing over the bridge, and it results in kind of a glassy, eerie, kind of scratchy sound. And to me, it was very haunting and very eerie. And I don't know how I come up with this idea of lost memories, but it seemed to me that was creating some sort of a background, almost like a whitewash from which certain other elements could emerge. So layered on top of that, or rather following that, are little bits and phrases. I wanted something very nostalgic. So instruments come in with small solos, some of them referencing back to, there's a waltz, there's a bit of an expressive line, there's a bit of a Chinese melody, and to me these are the collections of memories where you have one by one, they're kind of dancing around in your head, and then the whole thing fades away. So each movement is like that, a little vignette, an independent, a freestanding snapshot of a time, a place, an emotion.
And yet somehow they do all, there is something bigger that puts them all together. Obviously they're written by the same composer, but one still has the sense, in spite of all of the differences and contrasts, that there is, it's not literally a story, but somehow there is a narrative that finds its way through, and maybe it is just this sense of lost memories being suddenly coming to the surface. In fact, you've answered one of my questions, because the piece certainly has small and curious places, and occasionally it has dangerous places. And one of those dangerous places is it is very eerie. The part that you've referred to, where the strings are doing the sul ponticello, it's quite it's creepy in the most sort of fascinating way. The other thing I was curious, so one can, from remembering the previous piece, it is clear that you figured out that it wouldn't be a good idea to try and do the same thing. On the other hand, do you treat the instruments any differently this time? I guess I'm thinking particularly of the Chinese instruments. I'm wondering if you thought about them any differently from the earlier work.
I think in the earlier work, in quite a few of the movements, I started from the Chinese instruments, thinking about what they could do well, how they sound best, consciously quoting some, if not actual folk melodies, something very suggestive of a traditional folk melody. In this one, again, I was thinking more of a sound source. I think I was still very conscious, very respectful of what the instruments do and what they do well, but I did not go so far as to put them front and center, that is the Chinese elements. So in a way, they were treated differently, not the way that I wrote for them, but perhaps the material that they were given to play. They are challenging to write for because my music is quite chromatic, and several of the instruments are diatonic, strictly diatonic. So I had to build around them, giving them either kind of skeletal versions of a more chromatic line, or building my lines so it would incorporate the most chromatic sections of the diatonic scale. So it was coming at it from a different angle this time, definitely.